Pen and paper games are undeniably fantastic. The tense back and forth between player and dungeon master, all the time, energy, and luck required to make a good character and campaign sing in unison truly is the magic that binds up all those long nights telling stories and having fun with friends. Making a character and playing a persona is simple and fluid when you have other people to bounce off of. There's no barrier, no complications. You can have true reactivity to any character action. Want to just punch that senator in the face that just gave you a quest and go on the run to tear down the government with your own hands instead of doing whatever the real main quest was? Have that. You are truly limited only by your own imagination and how fast your panicking DM can flip through the monster manual to make new encounters on the fly. Video games, however, are not so lucky. Every aspect of them has to be planned, as many player actions predicted, and storylines crafted years before you will ever have the chance to play or subvert the many possible storylines available to you. This is to say that making a game that lives up to the role-playing part of role-playing game, where the end user can play any character they want in any way they want, is almost impossible, given the scope and breadth of creativity that any person might have for a character that they would like to play. And yet, some games have managed exactly that. Well, a few. Well, one or two or three, really, if we're going to be entirely honest. And saying that they accommodate for any possible character is still absurd, of course. It is entirely reasonable to assert, however, that they allow you to play any character you could reasonably imagine within the setting the developers have provided. Unfortunately, more games still have tried to allow you to play a character of your own making and fallen flat on their face, only throwing mild, if any, reaction back at you for the wildest choice and railroading you down the story that the developers demand you play in the way they demand you play it. They have sold their soul in the pursuit of more and bigger and short-term dopamine highs, as well as many other faults, failings, and foibles. That's not exactly what we're here to discuss today, however, because you see, modern game design is riddled with so many flaws it would be impossible to talk about them all. We are only going to look at three main pillars of roleplay in three different games and see what they can tell us about what makes a game good or bad for role-playing, specifically, and what facilitates role-play within a game. The first pillar of roleplay is your own character, simple enough. Attributes, perks, abilities, and more, all of these tell the game something about your character, and provide a springboard for you to imagine who that character is. This most often comes in the form of statistical interactions with your environment. Say your character is unusually strong and durable, but lacks intelligence or charisma. This could take the form in an angry barbarian, but could just as well coalesce in your mind as a well-meaning buffoon, delusional about just how boorish they come off to others. The important thing is that it gives both the game and you measurable parameters by which you can further craft your roleplay together. Giving your character a literal voice is the second pillar of all computer role-playing games, as what better way to create a dialogue with the player than to just have some? This also feeds nicely off both the pillar above and below, allowing opportunities for stats to be utilized to affect changes within the world. The important thing is that each dialogue is a choice, and an opportunity to further root and contextualize your character as a resident in the world. One of the best possible examples of this I can think of comes from a game we're not going to be talking about, which means I'm already cheating, Disco Elysium, where any given dialogue option might range from, "So, Mr. Necktie, who do you think the killer was?" Or, "Yes, I am a cop, and no, I'm serious. I am that poor, broke, and pathetic. Can I have $5 for a sandwich, or just take a bite out of yours?" Or, yet still, "No, I really think the killer was a communist ghost." The opportunity for you to play whoever you want is essentially endless. Meanwhile, Fallout 4 reduces dialogue to yes, no, and can I ask some questions before saying yes or no. We will get more into the meat of this later, so let's get into that last pillar. World reactivity. Doubtless the hardest pillar to get right even for non-role-playing games. Providing players with logical but unexpected outcomes or mere satisfaction for an incredibly difficult series of challenges and roles is something very few games really achieve. But when they do, it undeniably makes for some of the best roleplay possible, as it mirrors exactly what I first described, that back and forth between DM and player. So it is, in my mind, the ideal which RPGs ought to strive for, but also the conclusion of all of the pillars that came before it. This just compounds exponentially how much work goes into creating good choice and consequence within games, however. Really what I'm trying to get out of all of this is that the game must give reactivity to as diverse player action as is possible. This doesn't even have to be as wide-branching story changes as an entirely different world at one end of the branch than the other, but might be as simple as NPCs recognizing some consequence of player action or build. Now, that's the pedantic and boring part out of the way. Let's actually see how these things are used in role-playing systems and games with three main examples: Skyrim, The Outer Worlds, and Divinity Original Sin 2. Now, each of these games has their merits and strengths, but today we are only going to be looking at how well or poorly they allow for roleplay, specifically, and how their systems either incentivize and foster it, or ignore and squash the potential for roleplay, starting with, of course, our oldest friend, one of the major design flaws in questing Skyrim highlights... It's disingenuous to say that it only highlights one major flaw with questing in traditional RPG. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is, we're going to talk about how it highlights railroading the player and demanding that they play quests in a specific way. The quest to recover a few books from the Library of Winterhold comes immediately to mind. The setup is that a few books have gone missing, stolen by a former pupil, and the librarian needs those books back. Now, a well-designed quest might have the stolen books as only one way to finish the quest. Skyrim is, after all, a massive and huge systematically diverse world, which should accommodate for any number of ways of finding various copies of these books to return to the library. However, the game accepts only one conclusion: that you go into the dungeon, which you magically know of as a result of quest markers, and retrieve only those copies. Once again, I want to point out that it's not necessarily all that absurd that the librarian would want these specific copies back. That's reasonable enough. The problem with a quest designed this way is that it restricts player agency. There's no way to talk, steal, bribe, or coerce your way out of the situation, all of which seem possible for a task as broad as replacing a few books. The game demands that every character, every player, no matter how they imagine their avatar, to go into their dungeon and slay their way to the solution. This violates essentially all three pillars of roleplay by not allowing your stats to influence the quest, ignoring what the player has to say with dialogue options, and killing as many possibilities for multiple outcomes to the quest. While there is some small negotiation that can be done within the dungeon that leads to a little bit of different outcomes, the point is the quest must be solved in precisely one way. The previous quest highlights another problem with Skyrim, and by extension most modern games, and that is waypoints. Waypoints have their place, but mostly, I think, have a sort of insidious effect on the player, because I wouldn't be surprised if people often didn't think about how limited their options were, or thought much at all, since the game helpfully tells you exactly what to do at every conceivable turn. They instill in the player that they don't really need to roleplay, don't need to read or consider what's going on. They could just ignore almost every bit of text thrown at you, and just follow the magic psychic waypoints on the way to your next objective. It isn't much, but it does have a small effect on divorcing the player from the world around them. But unfortunately, playing without these magic psychic waypoints is impossible, as rarely are actual directions or indications of where an objective is given, as the mission designers very clearly know that most players will just have those little pins telling the player exactly where to go. That's enough griping about waypoints. Let's talk about the way that Skyrim ham-fistedly deals with player choices, or more specifically, the consequences for player choices. Skyrim is terrified that players will lose access to NPCs, so much so that it entirely just throws the concept of consequences out the window. It will never impose upon you something that might allow you to fail or would inconvenience you in any significant way. Oh, of course you can reach a failure state, obviously, but as long as you're alive, you can't really fail an objective, not one that has any sort of meaningful consequences for the wider world. And it is this sort of nakedness to Skyrim's artifice that really makes it frustrating. Many of the things that I've mentioned are true in a good number of RPGs, but few of them make it as obvious as Skyrim does. Let's look at an example where if you fight for the Stormcloaks, this is just blatantly, terribly obvious. The final mission of this has you attacking Whiterun, and while the actual attack is pretty fun, cinematic, and reasonably well executed for the time, the final objective is to make the Jarl of Whiterun surrender. You can resolve this by talking? No, you can't talk to him. You have to beat him into submission with swords and arrows and smothering him with lava. But don't worry, he's fine, because we're into the Skyrim anime now, and no matter how much lethal force is hurled at this man, he's fine, because the important characters can't die unless the script says so. Want to kill and replace him? Afraid not. He's important. Want to maybe try to assassinate him before this event? Again, no, he's important. He can't die, and there's no way to solve this except by playing out the mission in exactly the way the game demands, despite this seeming like an excellent time to let players exert some sort of agency towards a major town. Now, only giving the player one way to solve an issue isn't a problem per se, but it is a huge issue in an ostensibly free-form RPG. The approach to encounter design does make it feel more generically like a sort of typical action game circa Far Cry. Well, I say feel. Let's take a look at one more example of how Skyrim only wears the guise of an RPG. The persuasion system in Skyrim is bafflingly terrible. Let's look at getting into Riften for the first time as a pretty good example of this. When first arriving, the player is subject to a shakedown, and the options are essentially boiled down to persuasion. No. Huh? How about that? Or intimidation. I'll hurt you if you don't let me through. I'm gonna do something bad. Not only are these maybe the most generic possible ways to overcome this problem and show absolutely no creativity for attempting to create ways for players to express themselves through dialogue, but this also ensures that there are no consequences for the player's actions. How could there be? These are far too generic and weakly written to reasonably create any real ripples throughout the world. Making this even worse is that Riften actually has a certain character to it. You might have heard before you arrived there, or if you've played the game before, that the Thieves Guild is run out of Riften. So it would be only too easy to add a bit of character to the shakedown. Let's just borrow a little mechanic from Fallout New Vegas and add one option where we're just like, sneak, lie. I know you're probably working for the guild. You even see me coming? Nah, that's because I'm their new recruit. Now let me through. I'm on guild business. Not only have we created a better option that allows for more players to express themselves, but have set the opportunity for further consequences. Maybe after this we're approached by a member of the guild who's either impressed by our improvisation or angered at our bluff, and appropriately either presses us into the guild or poses some greater challenge for our buffoonish attempt to masquerade as one of their members. My point here is that not only is the writing bad from a simple perspective of being uncreative, but it's just bad scenario design from the perspective of trying to make interesting consequences for player actions and create that dialogue between game maker and player. There's just no opportunity for expression, no opportunity for reaction. There's only really one way events can play out, even though the player has various options available to them. They're pointless. So let's get on to giving Skyrim a grade on how well it did on each of our pillars of roleplay as we've described them so far, in internet-friendly numbers of a scale of 1 to 5. First off, there is your character. Your character almost doesn't exist. There are a small number of stats that essentially build them up, and many of your abilities can pass a surprising amount of checks or are very useful at low levels. Lockpicking and speech comes to mind, with a lot of the game's speech checks being pretty darn low, and the fact that you can pick any lock at level 1 of lockpicking. This makes Skyrim feel a lot more like a strict action game, and further works to disincentivize roleplay. Unless you want to roleplay as a Mary Sue, of course, which I guess the Dovahkiin kind of is, so I'm going to give that a 2 out of 5. So let's talk about dialogue. Not only is Skyrim's writing... oh god, it makes me so angry sometimes. It's so bad. Look, it is so bad that whatever sense of immersion you might be able to pull up, the incredulously bad scenario design constantly works to pull you out of. But, I mean, we're talking about dialogue specifically, not necessarily the writing, although the writing is an important part of the way the dialogue plays out. Look, there are few dialogue options that really ever differ from Fallout 4's later no, yes, and sometimes persuade, intimidate, no, yes, that more or less almost seem like placeholder text for how little color and character these lines have to them. It all really boils down to, you'll let me do what I want, or angry, you'll let me do what I want. They're terrible as alternate ways for solving dialogue in any meaningful capacity. It gets a 1 out of 5 for dialogue. It's terrible. Okay, so let's talk about world reactivity as the last pillar. There are a tremendous number of quests that arbitrarily railroad the player into a single path, even if that makes absolutely no sense for the quest at hand. The amount of NPCs that are flagged as essential and cannot die destroys any sense of agency, and even in vital quests that threaten change, the important NPCs just can't die, so that some other quest won't break down the line. I really feel like I'm living in a sitcom in Skyrim, where no matter what happens, everyone has to more or less end up back where they started so that next week they can all take part in some other shenanigans. It doesn't even get a 1, this is just a 0 out of 5. There is no world reactivity in any meaningful capacity. Enough of bashing on Skyrim. Everyone's bashed on Skyrim before. It's easy, it's low-hanging fruit, if I'm going to be entirely honest, but it is important to recognize a lot of the core aspects that many modern RPGs get wrong. Now let's talk about the Outer Worlds, and I think that the Outer Worlds is probably the most interesting game that we're going to talk about today when it comes to roleplay, because it does attempt to provide the player the tools they need to actually roleplay, but somehow it fails, and I think that somehow is really interesting to look at. And the shame is, it does start really strong. I love the little dialogue blurbs when you're making your character that talk about the ways that they are particularly good or bad at a diverse array of various attributes. The main problem I have with this system is that shoving down those attributes to the point where they are interestingly bad imposes so many negative aspects on your character. I sincerely doubt very many people actually engaged with the system in that way. It's kind of a shame, but I do still like that when you max out an underlying attribute, that it shows something interesting in the positive way about your character. Not something a lot more people probably will actually experience. Now, these don't have much impact on gameplay, except for, the intelligence allowing you to do the Fallout 2 style idiot run, where your character can barely speak in more than grunts, which that's fun, but it's more of a gimmick, honestly. That, I doubt very many people actually did, except for, the memes. So let's get on to talking about the way in which these systems start to fall apart. And to me, it's a lot the focus on combat, and how that makes every character more or less feel the same, because it is essentially impossible in Outer Worlds' system to create a character that is not very good at combat. This does work, admittedly, to solve a practical problem, as no doubt at least some people probably fell off of New Vegas, and yeah, I'm going to cheat again and talk about another game instead of the 3 games that I promised to talk about, and talk about New Vegas. Because when it came time to fight in New Vegas, some people might have realized their character just sucked. However, it says something about the design philosophy in turn, that you are going to fight a lot. I mean, for whatever narrative content you engage with, you'll probably spend 2 to 3 times as much fighting, and this was a pretty big letdown for me when I first played Outer Worlds. Again, unfortunately to bring it back to New Vegas, it started almost every combat encounter with a conversation, or led up with some sort of set of choices to a conflict. And even then, playing through Vegas again, you'll find that a number of combat encounters that you thought were unavoidable change entirely if you make good with the factions whose land you'd be traveling on through. Or vice versa, you might equally find that things that were entirely safe for you before are now just combat encounters. The Outer Worlds, on the other hand, deliberately chooses to isolate most of the consequences of any decision, so that you'll always be fighting the mindless marauders in wildlife and talking to the ostensibly good or at least neutral groups. This all highlights the interconnectedness of all things in RPGs, and how poor level design leads to poor character design, leads to poor results in the choice and consequence system. On top of that, I consistently felt coddled by the game, as though it didn't trust me to make a character that could traverse its world without deciding to leave it and run for a Steam refund as soon as possible. So instead, everyone is a hero, a savior, or a villain. You cannot fail to achieve your ends, no matter how terrible you might have built your character to be, because you can't build a bad character in Outer Worlds, essentially. Perks are another way the game fails to reinforce roleplay. Perks typically have some flavor tied to them in most games, and this was so well done in, you guessed it, New Vegas. Not only were perks more tied to your character, usually requiring some skill to acquire, but came with some pizzazz, like the cowboy perk, which made you better only with revolvers and lever-action rifles. Or Animal Friend, that made hostile creatures neutral and then friendly eventually at a higher rank. All of that helped the player to more firmly cement the idea of who they were in their own mind as their character progresses through the game. It's a wonderful idea. In the Outer Worlds, though, you can get, +5 to AC with no flavor text, or maybe as a top level perk, reduce enemy detection radius by 1/3. Wow! Not only are these effects basically irrelevant, I mean, how would you even know if your AC went up, down, or up by 5 in this game? I wouldn't, personally. But it also doesn't feel as though they meaningfully add anything to the weight of your character within the world. What does having a passive +5 AC tell me about my character? That you're a little tough? That's basically nothing. The optional flaws system also speaks to how afraid the developers were of posing even the smallest consequence onto the player. And this kind of talks again back to the world design as well. They were also very afraid of potentially inconveniencing the player there as well. So what are flaws? Flaws are optional negative perks you can take upon you usually have something in the environment happen to you, like taking plasma damage or taking fall damage a bunch, and taking them is entirely optional, which is weird. The whole thing just bewilders me, if I'm going to be entirely honest. If you're so afraid of a system that you just allow the player to entirely opt out, rather than trying to create some sort of more interesting, long-lasting consequences of the player, why bother at all? And it's such a shame, as the system has a lot of potential to leave these scars and create war stories for the player to talk about and remember. They might look back at their sheet and see that, oh man, I got this permanent debuff or this permanent change to my character because I walked through too much radioactive goo. You know, maybe you constantly glow like a flashlight, which, you know, maybe is good for a character that isn't interested in stealth and bad for a character that is. There are so many interesting ways that the system could have been put in or implemented, but the way that it was put in is probably the worst, just the worst. And I would be legitimately surprised if very many people engaged with it at all, since the flaws are generally terrible. A good example is an early one that you can find, and almost every character probably ran into, was that you can take a 50% weakness to plasma for 1 perk point, because each of these does give her a certain number of perk points. But that is horrendous. A top-level perk provides a 25% resistance to plasma and another damage type. So even at best, you're taking essentially what amounts to like a level 3 negative perk to get 1 perk point, which may eventually have an effect as good as the flaw. It's way too punishing for the benefit that you get, and I just don't... It's not a good system, but it could have been. It could have been. So, yeah, it's really unfortunate. So let's get on to talking about choice and consequence within the Outer Worlds. And first off, I want to say, I know I said this would be a discussion of 3 games, and I've already brought up a 4th and a 5th and maybe a 6th, but look, I need to explain a quest from Fallout to talk about the Outer Worlds more. And look, I know. But the Outer Worlds is this weird, unofficial Fallout sequel when you just rub the paint off a tiny bit. And it's impossible to consider outside of that context. So in Fallout, there's a quest where you find a town named Junktown. It was 1997, and you didn't have to be wildly creative with how you named things. It's run by 2 people, a no-nonsense lawman and a seedy casino mogul, and the player is pretty quickly tasked with deciding who to put in charge, as both want to see the other gone. The lawman for keeping the town's more illicit business from growing, and the casino mogul for bringing all the trouble to town you would expect a seedy casino mogul to bring to town. The real twist doesn't much come in the quest, as it's relatively straightforward. The twist comes at the end of the game when it's revealed via a Fallout end card that if you put the town in the hand of the lawman, it slowly withered and died without the casino's income. Meanwhile, the town flourished as a seedy den of iniquity under the mogul. Or at least that's what it would have been if they weren't concerned about that being confusing to people. It was supposed to play out like that. But the point remains that the idea for this was all written back in 1997. So let's come back to the starting area of Outer Worlds in Edgewater, as it highlights pretty well why the choice and consequence in Outer Worlds doesn't work for me. You need a MacGuffin, right? To get your ship to go away from here. You need a MacGuffin. But the guy who has the MacGuffin is all like, we need the MacGuffin to not die, so no. But also, we might be starving to death and ravaged by plague. But some of our people recently ran away from the plague to create a thriving agricultural center free of corporate tyranny, disease, and food shortages. You should go take their glazed MacGuffins. They would be much better off without them than we would, as they would have to come back to us. Unsurprisingly, the people who are not dying don't want their MacGuffin taken away either, as it would make them die instead. Now, the problem here isn't the dilemma inherently. I mean, it is a bit, since the incredibly derivative writing here from the original Fallout is present, and the payoff is also kind of basically the same, but I'll get to that. The problem is that I don't feel it's a particularly good choice that actually gives the player agency within the scenario. You're essentially given the situation, 2 solutions, and told to go to a power plant and literally press a button to resolve the situation. And there are very little consequences outside of Edgewater. Sure, there is a late game scenario that eventually brings back this choice a little bit, but the important thing is that your reputation with these factions is irrelevant, essentially. The best thing you get is some discount on vendor prices, which aren't even run by people, so you never really get to see or feel the consequences for your actions once you leave this place. You literally press the button, and that's it. There's a little bit of mediation you can do afterwards to soften out the edges and subtly optimize this scenario, which is its own problem that I'm going to get to in just a second. But my whole point is that there isn't really much consequence for this decision. That's a big problem, unsurprisingly. On top of all of this, I can't help but feel a bit of protagonist syndrome here, as I can't imagine why a shrewd businessman responsible for a whole town would just look at you and go, yeah, I trust you totally and completely not to screw me over. It's fine. I'm sure you're not evil, and nothing will go wrong. I'll do nothing to stop whatever choice it is you want to make. Okay, bud, go press the button for the good guys. Look, I get it. In 1997, choosing who ran a town out in the middle of nowhere and getting a slide at the end of the game telling you how much your choice mattered and how it played out was neat. But so many games have done so much more than that since then, and I think this in many ways marks a regression of game design rather than any kind of progression, or even, for that matter, a maintenance of the status quo. It feels hollow, and doubly so since the payoff is the same as the Junktown quest in Fallout. Side with the peaceful people who are actually working to solve the problems of the planet rather than worsen them, and they'll turn away the remaining citizens of Edgewater, and they'll all die, basically. But side with the corporate yes-man, and the previously gung-ho revolutionaries will return to the town, and you can even negotiate for the rebel leader to take control of the town, sharing her treatment with the flu. Oh, the plague was just the flu, by the way. They're just really bad at things in the future. And the ways that she was making crops grow. It's people. It's people. This option just feels optimal, however, and that's a problem in its own right. Putting everyone back to work, helping those in need of help, and providing a leader who is more reasonable is just the right choice. It's less, again, of a choice and more of a problem to solve. It strips player agency and dulls the impact of the writing significantly. It really feels like the devs had one way they wanted you to solve the problem, and any other way is just a bad end. Try again next time. The hypothetical strength of choice and consequence systems is the battle of ideals. Getting the player involved in an imaginary debate where all sides have valid points, pros and cons, you need to pick the people or the ideology you agree with is the point. And while it can be difficult to write scenarios that don't just offer a clearly optimal solution, it is something that Obsidian has accomplished before, multiple times. So they and their team, least of all, have an excuse in this regard. Amplifying this, those consequences remain almost entirely cordoned off to the confines of Edgewater, as I stated before. Outside of the ending slide, this is the last you'll hear of this decision, as important as it might seem. I think this is very emblematic of the overwhelming majority of decisions in Outer Worlds, which is to say, easy to solve and short-lived. As for the talking in this game, it somewhat ties into the flaws of the choice and consequence system. As a result of choices being relatively simple, a lot of your dialogue choices likewise boil down to the Bethesda soup of yes, no, or can I ask some questions before saying yes or no. While there are the occasional sparks of actual personality in the options, it isn't much better than saying a snarky yes or no, and none of the options allow you to play anything except the character that you see around you, a kinda goofy weirdo. Want to play something other than a goofy weirdo who does random stuff for people? Too bad. It really makes me think that they should have gone with a more sort of witchery approach, where the basic idea for the character is set, and you can make small guiding decisions within that archetype. It certainly really doesn't feel like you can effect much outside of the way that the developers intend for you to play the game, and it does feel like they had a definite intention on the path the main character was meant to tread. This is doubled down by the fact that every character is good at combat from day one. It really further pushes this singular archetype. But despite that, the game is still ostensibly some kind of free-form role-playing game. It's just not a particularly good one. Even with all of this, you do have some dialogue options based off of your various skills, but I don't think that these land particularly well, as they seem peppered in almost randomly without a ton of thought. Worse still, a lot of the generic persuade options still fit into that sort of placeholder template feel that I complained about in Skyrim, i.e., why don't you just let me do what I want, because my numbers say I can. Ha! Ha! So, let's sum it up and give some helpful numbers once again for these main pillars. In terms of your character's actual attributes, the Outer Worlds almost allows for a diverse array of possible options, but falls short in two major ways. First, by making almost every skill a combat skill. This presupposes so much about any character and funnels any design into that singular idea and archetype that I mentioned earlier. Someone who was really good at punching or shooting. You were a baseball mascot? Well, you must have also been a serial killer because hardened mercenaries cower at the first shot you fire. Oh, you were a cashier? I don't know how, but you know how to shoot a robot to immediately shut them off. For some reason. Second off is the perks, which really lack any identity at all and do very little outside of providing minor, basically unimportant stat buffs. Not only is this a disappointing missed opportunity from a gameplay perspective, but it denies you the opportunity to see your character grow and change from their experiences in a more explosive and interesting way. Dialogue is not great. So many games seem to have boiled down their dialogue to what I'm now calling the Bethesda soup. And I would really like to have thought that maybe Obsidian wouldn't fall into that soup, but alas, yes, no, questions, and snarky yes are the mainstay for the majority of the game. It really hurts all the more because some of those snarky yeses are actually pretty clever, and would have been great in a game that allowed for more types of roleplay through dialogue. I would have heaped ample praise upon them, but that just isn't how it played out. Choice and consequence is really where it falls apart for me. The choices far too often feel like they have strictly optimal solutions and consequences that rarely, if ever, stray beyond their area code. Not every choice needs to be a galaxy-spanning, capital I important decision, but it would be nice if at least one or two of them meant a damn thing to anyone except the ending slides. Instead, Obsidian really just thought to allow you to pick who one on each planet you visit through would be good enough. And even then, they have a clear idea of how they intended for players to decide who won, dampening even that choice. I really wonder, looking back at this game, why it even has choice and consequence as a main mechanic, when it really seems they just wanted to make Borderlands with a little more dialogue. I want to start off talking about Divinity 2 by telling a little story. It is the story of the fair maiden, the lady lizard, Rolka Santachow. Haughty, impetuous, and entirely sure of the superiority of her race. That is, until she was humbled, made into a slave and a vagabond. She swore that she would reclaim all that was taken from her, title, wealth, family. It would be hers once more, and she did not care what pathetic humans she would have to step on to get there, until a surprise. Butter. The odd scalelessness of this merchant drew her in, but the vow they made together to reclaim their lives and escape this vile place together cemented their bond. But alas, the butter that burns twice as hot melts equally as fast. When a disagreement with Butter's boss broke out and Rolka had to fight for her life, Butter joined her new love in combat only too readily. While Rolka would survive, her delectable Butter would not be so lucky. The only memento that Butter left was a journal in which she lamented her short and miserable life, except for that one shining moment when the kindness of a lizard woman gave her hope that she might finally have something to live for. Utterly enraged, Rolka swore a vengeance upon everyone who put Butter and herself in this place, most direly upon their jailer. Butter's journal in hand, Rolka set out. She would not rest, would not stop, even for a moment, until that vile magister was ended. When, weeks later, she finally tracked him down, and he begged for his life, said he had all the reason in the world to imprison them, that he had a vital role to play in events ahead. Rolka did not have to think. She had no compassion, and did precisely what she swore. With her vengeance done, Rolka tossed Butter's journal into a fire, finally allowing her and herself to rest at last. This emergent storyline was entirely the result of small bits of narrative sprinkled throughout the game, along with dialogue constantly reinforcing my character back to me, bits of player agency, and most importantly, a surprising amount of world reactivity to choices and build consequences, all allowing what might have otherwise been a trivial throwaway romance to turn into a through line that defined my character for the rest of the game. So let's talk specifics about how you get to this in your game, because so many aspects of Divinity are absolute fire, and of course it starts with character creation. And I want to talk about tags first of all, and tags are these little things, little bits of lore that you can tack onto your character, like saying that you were a noble or an outlander or an artist or what have you. And it just provides so much ability for you to headcanon your character's background, and gives opportunity within the game's dialogue for you to decide how much of that background and even your race influences how your character behaves in the environment. I absolutely love this system, and would ask how more games haven't figured this out, since it's so simple and yet so genius for helping to engender the character to be something more plausibly fleshed out, that the person playing them can actually sort of play them as a role within the environment. And they worked so well with dialogue even beyond that, and we'll get to talking a little bit about that when we talk about dialogue. So let's talk about perks as well. And while not some of the most detailed descriptions for perks that I've ever seen, they still work extremely well. And I often think about game mechanics these days and judge them most positively by how much they change up the typical rhythms of play. And there's a lot here within perks that do exactly that. I mean, First off, you have to have Animal Companion, right? I mean, there's a built-in mod in the game now that just gives your character Animal Companion, which allows you to talk to animals and help use animals to find context clues and solve problems in the environment. And look, this is just so fun and so changes how characters work that I understand why people just want it. It's so good as a perk. It just completely changes the way that you see the environment when that rat isn't just a random rat that's sort of set dressing, but something that could potentially guide you to an interesting and novel solution to problems that you never expected before. It's amazing, right? And then there are execute and quick step, both of which completely change the playstyle of a character, either incentivizing you to like try and chain enemies' health together to smaller amounts so that you can potentially chain a lot of AP together in a single turn, or giving your character more ability to move around the environment. There are so many wonderful perks that change entirely how your character functions within combat and meaningfully extend what your character is doing and who your character is in terms of the character role that you're playing. It's just, oh god, it's so good. And then there are so many actual combat skills that have so many uses in and outside of combat to play around with and find multiple solutions to puzzles, especially with like things that allow you to teleport, being able to allow you to get into places that it really doesn't seem like you should be able to get objects into places they aren't supposed to be. It's so good. And all of that just comes down to how diverse an array of tools they've given you to build your character with. It's really absolutely wonderful. Now let's talk about dialogue. And my god, after playing Skyrim in the Outer World, it feels indescribably good to play a game that has, like, dialogue, like actual dialogue trees that lead to crazy things like, I don't know, divergent outcomes. What? Seeing a game with something other than the Bethesda soup is incredibly gratifying. Really, you don't have to look past the first dialogue you encounter where you have the opportunity to act defiant, compliant, or pragmatic, each with differing dialogue outcomes from the NPCs that appropriately praise, respond, or even challenge or mock you for your various choices. It serves to create that wonderful back and forth where you actually put forth how your character acts and the game responds appropriately. Now this is role-playing. Anyone wondering how to actually make dialogue more interesting than yes, no, and a snarky yes, take notice. This is what good writing in games looks like. The dialogue works so well because every character, no matter how small, has some definition. Whether it's arrogant, mocking, or pragmatic, there's just a little, just a tiny bit of flavor to every NPC. It isn't much, but providing that definition makes for the opportunity for you to grow your character's identity as you bounce off of them, mimicking, again, that sought-after conversation between DM and player. It's beautiful to see that someone out there knows how to write a thing. I am, without a doubt, incredibly envious of the people who wrote this thing. And then there's choice and consequence, which sometimes I felt that the game remembered what I did better than me. The amount of times that characters came up to me and I was just kind of like, hey, I for sure remember you. Which might sound like the characters were unmemorable, but the truth is that my brainworms keep me from remembering things nearly as good as they should. There are so many quests that come back later, rewarding the player for fully exploring their environment in conjunction with bigger choices that can determine the fate of you and your companions. These big and small consequences work extremely well, but I specifically want to focus on that smaller scale to really bring this home. like I talked about with the dialogue, there are numerous branching ways that it can play out, often leading to vastly differing NPC responses, and that is really where the choice and consequence works so well, constantly reinforcing to the player in small ways, that their choices matter, even if they lead to largely the same outcome. It casts a veil over the player, which they are unlikely to see through, wherein they see their choices as being a lot more important than they technically are. And to me, that works really, really well, as it solves the common problem of how not to have massively inflating development costs, but allow players to feel like they're still making important decisions. And even at that, there are, through gameplay, a tremendous number of ways to resolve almost any of the really big problems that you have in quests as you go through the game. And, oh man, it is just so amazing to see a game actually offer choices. Like, I don't even know what I'm looking at after looking at Outer Worlds and Skyrim sometimes. Like, this is just, quite frankly, amazing, honestly. The systems that exist to create and expand your character as your journey unfolds are spectacular. You not only have the ability to play as a unique character you made yourself, but you can pick from a number of presets as well, which I didn't even mention. You can play with characters that have these preset stories and backgrounds that have their own unique quests to go through, essentially allowing you to play as a companion from something like a Mass Effect style game as the main character. You get to pick which of those you want to be the main character if you want, or you can just entirely ignore that. And what that does so well is wonderfully hybridize traditional role-playing styles with what I talked about earlier, with that sort of witchery style approach. But even then, when you play these characters, you can still entirely define the way they work mechanically and how much you want them to engage with their side story. It is basically the best of both worlds, and just perfectly hybridizes, again, that classic style with more modern role-playing. It's a 5 out of 5. It's not even hard. And as for the writing, I can't appropriately write about the writing. It's so much better than I could ever manage. The only thing I can do is just give it numbers that tell you it's the goodest of writing. It's a 5 out of 5 very easily. And choices matter a lot in this game on the macro scale, but again, most importantly, they matter on the small scale, constantly informing you of the character that you're playing back to yourself, helping you to grow that image of who you are within your own mind. And that's really what's missing from the majority of games. Who would have figured that if you constantly create a dialogue with the player and allow them to express themselves, that would be the best opportunity for roleplay. It's a 5 out of 5. Real easy, not even hard. What all of this has really shown me, more than anything, is that so much modern design is focused on making the player's experience smoother, even if that comes at the expense of the game that you're attempting to make. Bethesda, and so many like them, are so afraid that the player will just get bored and leave if they aren't given a new shiny toy every 5 minutes. They've cut the heart out of their games. They're hollowed out husks that do little else besides funnel the player to the next reward or bit of nebulous content to engage with. There can't be any dialogue or characters with motivations of their own, because that might get between you and the next carrot that they've dangled out in front of you. Real, living worlds and characters naturally make roleplay easy, but seem to terrify both publishers and developers for how much they might inconvenience the player. And so, instead of these vibrant worlds and characters, we get bigger and bigger Skinner boxes that are better and better at funneling players to the most vapid and pointless rewards. Just more numbers at the end of a pointy stick. Who wants this? Who wants games like Fallout 76? Who else is at best mildly interested in upcoming Bethesda products because this shift to open world, loot driven games has made Bethesda prove themselves to be all too willing to just put a bunch of garbage into a huge map. So many people have become disillusioned with games as time has gone on, and I can't help but share this sentiment, at least with bigger development houses, because as this particular case study has highlighted, the majority of games now prioritize addictiveness over good design. The sad part is, this only makes too much sense. Why spend years developing complex interweaving dialogue, deep, interesting characters, an engaging, well-written plot, and complex gameplay systems that reward creativity and inventiveness from the player when you can just sprinkle a little cocaine around and probably no one will notice the difference? So that is finally done. This took way too long and ended up being a lot bigger than I expected it to be. But yeah, it's finally here. So yeah, I sorry if this came across as a little bit rushed, at least with the production look to it. I've had a lot of real life happen within the last week or two. So yeah, I'm just happy to have it done in whatever state that this thing is done. A lot of this came about as an argument that I had with a friend a month ago when we got into like what makes an RPG good or not. So take that, our rebuttal, Kaiser. Bet you won't even watch it all because you're lazy and a bastard, man. But yeah, it's finally done, and I can finally move on to things I actually want to work on more than this. And also I'll probably work on some smaller stuff. Probably talk about Cosmodread next week. It's a pretty decent little horror game. I have some thoughts on it for VR that I've not seen anyone talk on yet, and that's an exciting thing because usually you don't get to talk about things that you haven't seen people talk about before in VR. So that'll be good. That's pretty much it. That's really all I got to say. Thanks for watching. You're great. I didn't say anything about like and subscribe to the thing. Bye.